Self-inflicted damage. That's what happens when leaders make a bad situation worse with poor communication. I'm Bob Mann, and this is episode 414 of Hot Media. And the topic of this episode is crisis communication. You saw my guest just briefly for a second there, and there you see him on screen right now. For many people, that is a very familiar television face. That is Steve Adubato. Steve is a broadcaster, an author, and a motivational speaker. He's an Emmy Award-winning anchor for programs airing in this market on WNET, Channel 13, and NJPBS. He's a media and political analyst and also host of Steve Adubato's Lessons in Leadership with co-host Mary Gamba, which airs on News 12 Plus, and it's based on the Steve Adubato book, Lessons in Leadership. Dr. Adubato has served as a distinguished visiting professor on the subject of leadership at New York University, and he's also lectured at a number of colleges, including Caldwell University, where I'm the chair of Communication and Media Studies. And Steve had for years taught with me in a course called ED 707, which was Media Skills for Leaders. Steve, thank you. I know that you have a very busy schedule. Thank you for joining me here.
My pleasure, Bob.
Let's begin. We're talking about crisis communication. That is what this particular episode of Hot Media is about. And I keep hearing, because I've sat in with lectures with you, I've read your books. I just read one chapter from your newest book, which is Lessons in Leadership 2.0, which is coming out soon. And you keep using the phrase, own it. What does it mean when I'm a leader and I'm communicating and there's a problem and I own it?
Well, let's look at this as we're actually recording this, Bob. The Biden administration, the president himself, seems to have a hard time, quote, owning their screw-ups regarding classified documents found, I don't know, in the garage, in the room off to the garage, somewhere in his house. I don't understand it. I don't understand the president. I don't understand our previous president. I don't understand how so many of our elected officials and other people in prominent leadership positions don't simply own their screw-ups, own their mistakes. My bad. I own it. My fault. Here's what I did wrong. Here's what I'm going to do moving forward to fix it. It's a lot of, well, it's complicated. You don't really understand. It's not the same thing as what the other person did. A lot of it's whataboutism, but what they did is worse. And I often wonder, as a student of leadership, where along the line, Bob, did we get to the point where acknowledging that we didn't handle something as well as we should have, which, I don't know, 3 times today, at least that I know of, I screwed up. You acknowledge it. Other people know you didn't handle it as well as you should have, and then just simply say, my bad, I own it. There's a book behind me. If you're seeing on video as well as audio, it's called Extreme Ownership, written by 2 Navy SEALs. Forget about extreme ownership. How about just a little bit of ownership and just say, look, I'm the leader. It happened on my watch. I'm responsible. Here's what's going to be done to address it. I don't believe people think less of you when you do that. In fact, I think quite the opposite. People respect you more as a leader who is flawed, like all of us who lead and attempt to make decisions and lead other people and try to get things done and screw up in the process. You're in a leadership position. You will make mistakes. It's the nature of the job.
The reason there's a smile on my face, Steve, is that I just read one of the chapters from your newest book, which is not even out yet, in which you said that the vice president of your organization, Mary, and also your wife, has said that sometimes you use the phrase, I own it, just to get out of the conversation and walk away. You can't overuse it, right?
I own that.
You own that. Good. Well, it's done. We're totally off the hook. Now, one of the things, and in the book that I'm still teaching ED 707, and there is the book that is required, Steve Adubato, PhD, What Were They Thinking? A lot of stories of people, including educators, who have over the years just not owned it, made it worse, dug a hole that was 10 times deeper. So often you talk about, that it actually can be worse to have the cover up than what the problem was to begin with. But here, and I've always said this to you in class, is my concern. In reading your chapter from your newest book, you mentioned a general You mentioned General Colin Powell as somebody who really did own it about Iraq, but another general who was the victim of something bizarre where an enlisted man or some subordinate snuck in a pornographic picture into his PowerPoint presentation.
It's
And
Hank Kersey.
and he took it on the chin, the general did, but he got fired and he was drummed out of the service. Can it sometimes blow up in your face and be almost unfair that you're the one who had to take it and own it?
Absolutely. But here's the funny thing about leadership. It's not for everyone. And in fact, leadership's not fair, Bob. And if we are only going to quote unquote own it, when we're pretty sure that the consequences will not be adverse, or we will not lose our job, or nothing bad will happen to us, then it would be easy to own things. But the challenging part of by the way, it's not called lessons in mediocre leadership, lessons in average leadership. It's really lessons in exceptional leadership. That's the standard. And I'm not saying I live by it all the time. I'm not saying I stand that I live up to that standard on a regular basis. What I'm saying is, why advocate mediocre leadership? Why advocate? Well, I often get into a discussion with my wife. Hopefully she won't listen to this. She'll say, well, other people do that. If we talk about our kids who do something in particular, or handling an issue at other people do it. And my response is, look, if that's the standard we're going to hold ourselves to, then every president, every governor, every head of a university, every head of a company or a nonprofit can say, well, others do it. That's whataboutism. What about that other person? What I'm saying is, let's try to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We're going to fall down. We're going to fail. We're going to make mistakes. But if Hank Kersey, here's the deal. In the book Extreme Ownership, written by these two Navy SEALs, they argue that you are responsible for everything that happens in your universe. Now, Bob, think about this. I'm the leader of several organizations. You've led several as well. But here's the way I look at it. I am the anchor and managing editor of several PBS or programs that air on PBS in our region. If a chyron goes up wrong, if the title goes up wrong, if a sponsor's name is up wrong, if there's an editorial mistake that is made, if something is said in my ear by a producer and I say it out loud and something goes wrong publicly, what do? Do I turn around and go, oh, it wasn't me. It was the producer in my ear. It was the person who typed in the information on the screen. Nobody cares. I am responsible for everything that happens in my universe. I didn't say it was fair, Bob. And if I were to lose my job, or if I were to get canceled, or I lost a sponsor, that's part of what it means to be an excellent leader, that you run that risk. But the alternative of playing the blame game, Bob, there's an expression in media and communication you know better than most. If you're explaining, you're probably losing. So if I start explaining all the detail, well, it wasn't me, it was this one, it was that one, nobody cares. Just own it. It's on your watch and they're on your team, and you put them in that position to be there, and therefore you're responsible for their actions. I didn't say it was fair. I just believe that's exceptional leadership.
One of the things you talk about in class, you put up, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you put up the goalposts. Keep it within the goalpost. What does that mean, and how can that save someone from being a bad leader in terms of communication when there's a crisis?
So the whole goalpost concept is that inside the goalpost, that's your main message. That's the message you want to get across. This is about being a disciplined, strategic, methodical, very aware, effective public communicator. Now, I'll watch our president, our previous president. I'll watch a whole range of people, a lot of sports figures. They'll get asked a question about one thing. They'll respond, and then there'll be a moment of silence or a pause, or it's awkward, no one's saying anything. And then the leader, if you will, the person being interviewed, they just keep talking. And the longer you're talking beyond you saying exactly what you wanted to say, you're more likely, Bob, as you well know, to say something you wish you hadn't said. Then you'll say, well, I was taken out of context. Well, she asked me that. He asked me that. I don't care what they ask you. Answer the question precisely, concisely, pivot back to your main message. Now I'm done. I'm not going to talk anymore. Talk longer, you're going to get into a problem.
And stay on the subject. They wander off and go into all different places, and it becomes terrible. I've seen you do demonstrations with people who want to be educational leaders, and these are very, very smart people who, as teachers, have been in front of a classroom. How can they not have these skills? But they get scared. They also go with this whole idea of, how nature abhors a vacuum, that TV and radio abhor silence. They feel they have to fill that silence. They don't have to fill that silence. But let's just talk about educators. I'm going to be a little selfish here. I actually play this
I
clip
call it
in my
strategic. You're being
in my
strategic, Bob.
I am being strategic. Thank you very much, Steve. I should have stayed in the goalpost and not explain what I was doing.
Exactly.
But just a little bit about how some educators, and this goes back to the book that I've been using, which is one of your earlier books. What were they thinking? To some of the cases, you don't even have to mention the names of people if you don't want to, who had a situation that was bad and they made it really bad.
Yeah. The one that stands out to me, and your students, I hope some of them remember this. It was a tragic situation. It was the Exxon Valdez fiasco. The ecosystem was destroyed in that part of our country, and I remember the wildlife. I remember the oil slick. It was just destroyed. It was horrible, and for people lost their livelihood, and there were pain and suffering, and not to mention the wildlife that suffered and died. And I'll never forget the CEO of Exxon. They kept saying, his name is Lawrence Rawls. Look it up, Rawls. You got to come up here. You got to come up here and talk to the people who are dealing with this. You got to deal with the media. You got to be on site. And Lawrence Rawls, 13 days, I believe he went, never said a word, and finally said, well, what would I do going up there? I'm not an environmental engineer. I can't clean up the oil slick. You're the leader. You're responsible. I didn't say you were legally culpable or you're liable. I didn't say that. The courts will determine that. But he was so tone deaf. He chose not to be helpful. He chose not to try to show empathy and compassion. That case stands out to me very clearly. And the other one that stands out was JetBlue. You remember, listen, we're doing this in the winter of 2023, and there are problems at airports all around this country for a variety of reasons. But I believe, I forget the year, Bob, but it was on Valentine's Day. It was particularly cold that year. And JetBlue, there's a JetBlue case study in What Were They Thinking? And in the JetBlue case study, people were in a plane for 10, 12 hours. They just sat on the runway. And the CEO of JetBlue decided to go on David Letterman. You've seen me show that video before, right, Bob?
Yeah.
He decides he's going to go on David Letterman and show how human he is. And the problem is David Letterman was there to ask tough questions and also get a lot of laughs out of it. And the problem for the CEO of JetBlue at the time was that the laughs were at his expense. He said things like, well, I didn't sleep for days. It really kept me up at what? It's not about you not being able to sleep. And then he said, well, other airlines had problems too. And then he mentioned the other airlines, meaning you're mentioning the competition, say, well, what about them? And then he said, sometimes we have weather. And the audience is laughing. Why am I saying all this? Because that CEO went on David Letterman without being prepared, didn't understand the venue, didn't understand the interviewer, didn't understand the audience. He was tone deaf. He was being laughed at. And
you have to know where you are and what the context is and who this host is and who this interview is. And are you on an entertainment show or a news show? You have to know the whole landscape.
Think about Stephen Colbert, who's a friend and neighbor here in my hometown of Montclair. But Stephen Colbert, pre his late night show, when he was a character and embarrassed an awful lot of leaders in public positions, and Stephen Colbert hosting a legit late night talk show as who he is. Meaning, right, yes. You don't just say, well, I'm just going on a show. Like, who is the interviewer? What's their personality? Who's the audience? What's the audience? What kind of show is it? That's being strategic. And I believe that the leader of JetBlue at the time, the CEO, just got it totally wrong.
I'm going to ask you just one more question, because in your new book, you talk about the Jets quarterback. I'm a sports fan, as you are.
At least he's
And
the quarterback as we are speaking today. I'm sorry.
well, yes, he was the quarterback on that particular day. There have been a cast of thousands since, obviously, not just his backup, but on the last game of the season too. But the thing is that what did he have? 2 yards passing, and someone asked a reporter, and sports reporters in the New York market are tough. And they said, "Did you let your defense down that you were so bad?" And he yelled out, "No." But that's not really what I want to ask you about. I want to stay in the NFL. When Damar Hamlin went down, and you had tens of millions of people watching ESPN Live who switched in a heartbeat over to worrying about a game score for the AFC top seed, and went over to the idea of a human being who may not actually make it. That was a great moment in sports television and sports media for me. But how about the NFL? How did Roger Goodell handle it? Was he right to do things the way that he did, to cancel the game? Or was he wrong in the sense that you waited like an hour to find out if they were even going to cancel or postpone or suspend the game?
This is, Bob, where it becomes very unfair what I do as someone who analyzes media, who's a participant in the media, who coaches in the field of public communication, and for someone like you who knows media way better than most as a practitioner and as an academic. But we often judge, analyze, and critique after the fact, meaning Roger Goodell's in the situation. The NFL officials are in the situation. So after the fact, we look at the information we have, and then we try to act as if this is what we would have done, or this what was not done as well as it should have been done. But we have all this information we didn't have before. So here's the way I look at it. Would I have liked the NFL to have acted faster to cancel the game? Yes. However, they canceled the game. And so we're not comparing it to perfection. We're comparing it to really bonehead, terrible, insensitive mistakes that are made by organizations and their leaders. This was not a terrible decision. It was a reasonable decision. And then not counting that game, or having that game just not being counted in the standings, and figuring out this isn't even about sports. It's about trying to make the best. This is the funny thing about crisis communication for leaders. You don't win, Bob. You don't win. What you do is you minimize the downside. You minimize the damage. You come out of a difficult situation not looking great, but better than you would have looked like if you had handled it poorly or differently. That's why this is not a game of perfect or terrible. It's often somewhere in between. I find it hard to be critical of the NFL. And I would say this is not what the course is about, but to see the nation come together, to see the world of sports come together, to see his teammates come together. I'm a Giant fan, but I'm rooting for Buffalo at the same time if the Giants aren't in it. Why? Because there's something about Damar Hamlin and that team, and seeing people care about a person, a young man, 24 years old, I think 23, 24 years old. It seems to me it's way bigger than football. And with our nation being as divided as it is, I know that's not the purpose of our podcast, and the media being a positive part of that, just being together for just a moment is a pretty great thing in our nation.
Steve, I can't thank you enough. I know you have a very busy schedule, so many different television shows, so many appearances, guest lectures, continuing to write with, Lessons in Leadership 2.0, the tough stuff. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with me here on Hot Media for the podcast, and also for my using the podcast in the class. It really is so valuable. Thank you so much.
Well, Bob, I appreciate you. I appreciate Caldwell University, to your students, to all the students at Caldwell University. I wish you nothing but the best. And hopefully this conversation that we just had about media and leadership and public communication has been just a little bit helpful. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to thank Mary Gamba for doing all of the work to help me get in touch with Steve and to do a little bit of the prep work, and also to see some of that book, which is going to be coming out very soon. And I want to thank you for listening to Hot Media with Bob Mann, still primarily an audio podcast on the major platforms, but also you can watch us on YouTube, and the email address, if you want to write to me, is profman53, PROFMANN 53 at gmail.com. And of course, what I'd like you to do is also to go to my website, which is www.bobmanhotmedia.com, to find out everything about the podcast and hear our archives. And we hope that you listen and you watch and you subscribe to Hot Media. Thank you so much for watching this episode.